You are listening to We Saw the Devil, an investigative and conversational true crime podcast that deep dives into fascinating criminal cases that are solved, unsolved, or ongoing. From America's Lori Vallow to Germany's Armin Meiwes, we examine and discuss the world's most shocking cases. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to follow us online. Check us out at WeSawTheDevil.com and We Saw the Devil on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And don't forget, you can become part of the show by backing us on Patreon. Hello, everyone. You are listening to We Saw the Devil. This is Robin, and I'm super excited for this episode. This is a topic that I've kind of considered doing for about a year and a half now, but just never really felt that the time was right, and I feel like the time is right. It's something that I've read a lot of biographies on, and it's a time period that I'm obviously pretty obsessed with. And it's a time period that when I was younger, I just did not care about at all, and then the older I get, the more fascinated by it I am. So I want to know, and ask all of you listeners, can you remember the first Disney movie that you saw as a child? I mean, safe to say, I think we pretty much all can. For me, it was Pinocchio. I remember being simultaneously totally enthralled by, but also terrified by Pinocchio, especially the whale scene and then when the little boy is turned into the jackasses. Then I saw the classics, Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland. You know, all of the standard Disney films that most little girls actually end up seeing. Maybe it's even less prevalent today, but I distinctly remember even just 10 years ago, little girls fantasizing about being a Disney princess. That's still going on? I wouldn't know. I do not have children. Ariel, Jasmine, Belle, Aurora, Rapunzel, Snow White, Cinderella, and a lot of Disney princess Halloween costumes. For decades, parents have largely felt safe about letting their children watch Disney movies, and it ushered them into this entire ecosystem of the Disney company. Hundreds of films with merchandise and music to back it up in various retail stores across the country. Disney is absolutely everywhere. Whether it's Walmart, Target, the Disney Store, CVS, Disney branded stuff is absolutely everywhere. And not only that, but they have theme parks, real places where you can take your children to be fully enveloped in Disney. Themed hotels, themed rides, characters from your favorite movies all dressed up, walking all across the park. My first trip to Disney World was when I was 5 years old. And honestly, I remember pretty much absolutely nothing. But it holds such a special memory for me because my mom, who most of you know passed away from COVID in 2020, because she held it so close, that entire experience. She would get so excited and happy describing how shy and excited I was when I met Mickey Mouse and how I had the biggest smile on my face and I was giddy. And one of my favorite pictures I now have is from that trip. And she's all smiles hugging Goofy at a breakfast at the resort that we stayed at. Disney is the facilitator of memories. And for children, it's an absolutely magical experience. And it's no wonder that so many families, not even just in America, but across the world, flock to Disney World in Orlando, Florida each year. In 2018, Disney World had more than 58 million visitors. I mean, think about that number. 58 million people. The country of Italy has a population of 59 million. So imagine almost every single resident in the country of Italy going to Disney World in one single year. I mean, it's just insane. And that level of patronage is evidence of how popular the Disney Corporation is. As the second largest media company in the world, it's worth roughly $180 billion as of November of 2022. People think of theme parks like Disney World or Disneyland and the thousands of films that have been produced in its studios. But what you may not be aware of is that Disney goes beyond Mickey Mouse and The Little Mermaid. The Disney Corporation has purchased companies that are involved in everything from movies and television and music, video games, and don't forget they even have a whole-ass cruise line. The list of TV networks and channels that it owns will absolutely shock you. Now, you've heard of goths, you've heard of emo, but do you know what a Disnerd is? There's even an entire subculture for adults who are just completely devoted to Walt Disney. So how exactly did Disney become the powerhouse entity that it is? And are all of the salacious rumors about it true? And that's what this series is going to be about. As you can imagine, there are some really dark and interesting stories to be found in a company with such a robust and lengthy history. Also, interestingly enough, its place in history, the time that we're talking about. And we're talking Nazis, anti-Semitism, sexism, sex parties, orgies, accidents, deaths, and even murder. And we're going to talk about all of these things and more. So before we get into this introductory episode to this series, let's just get our quick housekeeping out of the way. You're listening to We Saw the Devil. You can find me at wesawthedevil.com. From there, you can find us across all social media, including Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also send an email and check us out on Patreon. Also, if you're enjoying the content, please take 5 seconds out of your day to leave a 5-star review. It lets us content creators know that you're liking what we're doing and, do more of it. So to understand the relevance and importance of Walt Disney in history, we're going to travel back. Way back. Back to 1825 back. Trust me, guys. Trust my process. There's a reason why we are doing this. So back in 1825, French inventor Nicephore Niepce decided to channel light through a camera obscura onto a pewter block that was coated with bitumen. The result was the oldest surviving photograph in human history. Leave it to France, right? The technique made its way around the world with variations being made on it. Have you ever wondered how people took pictures of the Civil War back in the 1860s? That was the first war that was ever photographed. I know, despite what the History Channel says, it was not aliens. It was actually dozens of professional photographers who went out to the battles. Some were skilled individual photography hobbyists, some were hired by the Union and Confederate armies, and they took pictures of the buildings, the battlefields, the troops, the landscapes, and even did portrait shots of important war generals. The thing is, though, is that every time they took the picture, there was between about a 5 to 25 second time. So everything in the frame had to be super, super still. That means that no action photos could be taken of the war. And as a fun side note, if you're ever wondering why people just look so damn pissed off in early photography, and especially like Victorian photography and whatnot, it's because those heifers had to sit still for sometimes like 30 minutes to an hour at a time, just waiting. I'd be mad too, to be honest. So early on, photography, it became a hit. In the beginning, only just a few people were involved in it, but as everything happens, when a technology is founded, it starts off super expensive and then gets cheaper as more business comes out and more products are made, more people jump in the game, the price goes down. That's what happened. So by 1861, Britain itself had more than 2,000 full-time photographers. That's insanity. Between 1825 and the late 1870s, they had that long, like 50 years, photographers mastered the skill of printing onto metal plates. And photography at that point was a real part of everyday life. It wasn't just for the elite anymore. Have you ever played a video game like Red Dead Redemption or seen an old classic Western film? There's almost always a picture, like a photography store in town. Photographers would actually buy or rent a small room, use it as their studio, and they would take photographs of people for like $0.25 a piece, 10 cents a piece. They'd have different rolls of backgrounds that they would pull down, almost like a theater backdrop, and they would take pictures for whoever paid them. And some of my very favorite pieces of pop culture come out of this. If you look, you can find pictures of Native Americans, cowboys, sex workers, businessmen, and everyday people, all from the mid and late 1800s. It was like a really, really early Olin Mills, but they'd already mastered the craft of still photography. So the question of, hey, do you think we can capture events in motion, began to heavily loom. And this is where robber baron Leland Stanford comes in. He was wealthy beyond words. And you might have actually heard of a little university named after him called Stanford University. Well, back in the 1800s, they didn't have social media controversies surrounding the color of a dress or a pair of shoes. They had a little thing called the unsupported transit controversy. Sounds salacious, I know. And what was this big controversy that gripped the nation? The question was, do all 4 of a horse's hooves come off the ground when it runs? I know, but at that point in time, your everyday layperson was like, what? And the scientists were like, what? And the preachers and the ministers and the educators were like, what? No one knew. Horses were super important at this time, as you can imagine. They served as cars, trucks, taxis, and tanks. And Stanford and his colleagues consistently argued about this. So Stanford commissioned a photographer by the name of Edward Muybridge to take the photos to settle a $20,000 bet once and for all. And Edward Muybridge was quite the character himself, y'all. He was born in England and then immigrated to the United States in 1820 and worked as a bookseller. At age 30, he was involved in a deadly carriage accident. The horse went completely rogue. I mean, just wild. It killed the driver, it killed a passenger, severely, critically wounded a few of the others that were in the cabin, and he was ejected from the carriage, but hit his head on a rock when he landed. Apparently, it really messed with him because he supposedly had really bad personality shifts. He became quick to anger and was generally overall hostile. During his time in the hospital, though, he was exposed to photography, and he fell in love with it. So much so that he decided to make it his career, which he did by selling original landscape photos both as an individual and also by being contracted by the US government. When Muybridge was 42, he married a 21-year-old woman named Flora. They ended up having a son named Florado. And as I said a moment ago, he was known for landscape photos. That meant that he had to travel a lot. He dealt a lot with U.S. parks, well, what a lot of these places now known as U.S. national parks. So like Yosemite, he would stay at Yosemite for like 10 months out of a year. Needless to say, he had a 21-year-old wife at home, and she was probably pretty lonely as a single mother being home constantly. So, during a period of time at home in 1871, good old Edward came across a letter that his wife had written to a man named Harry Larkins, a drama critic in their town. Inside of the letter, there was a picture of Edward and Flora's son, Florado, except at the back of it, the caption read, "Little Harry." So because this was in the 1800s, there was no ability to just hop on Facebook and make a messy Facebook status. Edward grabbed his pistol, took off on the next train to a rural cabin where he knew Harry Larkins was staying. Edward approached the cabin door and knocked. A man who he didn't recognize answered, so he asked for Harry. As soon as Harry approached the door, Edward said, "I have a message for you from my wife," and then he shot him dead. He scar-faced this man in front of like 7 people. After the incident, there was a 3-day murder trial. He pled insanity. Apparently, he was quite handsome before the incident, but after, he became haggard and stopped shaving his beard. Other people have written that he looks like Walt Whitman, which can I just say how much I freaking love the big diss of "you look like you smell" was basically the equivalent of "you look like Walt Whitman." Naturally, Flora filed for divorce on December 17th, 1874 on the grounds of extreme cruelty. But that first divorce request petition was dismissed. This was partially due to the fact that she fully supported her husband being prosecuted for murder, the fact that she was cheating on her husband and had that man's baby, and then pawned it off onto her husband. People back then felt like all of this was her fault. Edward was tried for murder in February of 1875, and his attorney, who, by the way, was paid for by a man named Leland Stanford, used the insanity plea. They said his anger and erratic behavior were both due to the documented head injury from his stagecoach incident 11 years before the murder. And the jury agreed. The jury went on to explain that they could not punish a man for, quote, doing something that they themselves would do in similar circumstances. So he was free. And just a couple months after that, Leland Stanford himself hired Edward to photograph his beloved racehorse, Occident, in a full gallop. That hadn't been done before. A special track was created. He was able to snap 12 photographs in rapid succession, showing that yes, Leland Stanford was in fact correct. All 4 hooves at one point leave the ground. Hashtag the more you know. Muybridge became the first person at that point to use photography in a way to show motion. But he wanted to show the photographs themselves moving. A couple years later, in 1880, technology had advanced. Muybridge then projected Horse in Motion onto a zoopraxiscope disc, which became the first film by its technical definition ever made. But what about film in the way that you and I know it? Well, that came 8 years later in 1887. And this is perhaps the most important figure in the history of film. A French inventor and photographer named Louis Leprince became the first person to create a single lens camera that was capable of recording motion. And he made a lot of short films. And I'm talking about really short, like 2 to 3 seconds short. The most famous one, the film everyone knows as the, quote, first film ever made, is Roundhay Garden Scene. Now, if you have not seen this, I have put a link to the YouTube video in the show notes. It's really one of the most important moments of human history, and it's really wild to see. The video I'm linking actually shows you the original, but then also where some film nut also decided to both stabilize the video and then convert it to 60 FPS, so it makes it a much smoother watch. But you can see the original. It has 4 people in it, including Leprince's son. It's just 2 seconds long. 2, that's it. And this just blew people's minds. Leprince films became known worldwide. Inventors, artists, and photographers flocked to see his films, of which he made many. Thomas Edison, who most of us know as the man who created the design for the modern light bulb, he was one of Leprince's biggest fans. And that was due to the fact that Edison had been working on his own type of motion picture camera. After becoming quick friends, Edison and Leprince had a massive falling out of patents. And then, mystery time. So 2 years after Roundhay Garden was made, Leprince, who was then at that point fully based out of England, was set to join his wife and kids in America. He was actually set to present his motion picture camera. He visited his brother in a Parisian suburb, and then he took a late-night train into Paris so that he could begin travel to the United States. And he never made it into Paris. He never emerged from that train station where his friends were waiting for him. Scotland Yard, the French police, and his family and friends all looked for him for years. But he was gone, literally never to be seen or heard from again. Now, Leprince was legally declared dead 7 years later, and a whole host of conspiracies emerged as to why he disappeared. Some of those include his brother killing him because he was the last to see him alive, bandits killing him for his money, his own family ordering a hit on him, or a rival inventor, Thomas Edison, killing him in the patent wars. Half of Leprince's family believed that Thomas Edison himself could have ordered the hit on him, especially since Leprince was on his way to America to showcase his motion picture camera, which would have officially given him recognition as the first man to do so. Now, Leprince's family eventually got into a nasty lawsuit with Thomas Edison, but there was no evidence and the crime has never been solved. And strangely enough, just 2 years later, Leprince's son, Adolphe, was discovered dead in a fire in New York City. Foul play was suspected. There's a lot of this story that I'm leaving out, and it's very much worth reading up on if you're interested. For me, the golden age, like the beginning of cinema through the golden age of Hollywood is like my sweet spot of my interest. I am obsessed with it. So I'm not going to go into all the insane details of this, but for the sake of the greater theme here, I'm not going to be delving into the history of the camera making and the mystery surrounding Leprince's death. In 1892, Thomas Edison announced the invention of the kinetoscope, a machine that could project the moving images onto a screen, and then this brought us into the almost there level of filmmaking. By 1894, Edison had opened up public film screenings in stores called kinetograph parlors. And this is wild. He owned all of them, like that was his thing. He had them all over the country. A kinetoscope was a large box. Imagine a podium in an auditorium, like a big thing, that had a level top on it with a box sitting on it. There was a peephole at the top where a person could bend down and look into it. They would then put a quarter in, and then that would actually cause a series of rollers to go off, feeding the film that was in the box, and then it was projected inside. It was like a steampunk version of an Oculus Rift. And fun fact, oftentimes these parlors would also have the phonograph, which, no surprise, Edison had also invented. He would charge people 5 cents a time to listen to a record through headphones. And here's the thing. Edison was a greedy bastard. He didn't want anyone to have the ability to do this at home. He didn't want any other inventor or production company or factory to be able to make his inventions. He wanted to keep all of these things luxury items that people could only get through him. Obviously, other companies and inventors disagreed. His inventions were quickly overshadowed by new technology, chiefly being the cinematograph, created by Louis Lumiere. And this was a projector that could show 16 frames per second. People would come to theaters to watch videos of a baby eating, water coming out of a hose, trains driving down the track, or people dancing. One of the biggest draws was a group of workers coming out of the Lumiere factory. And people were completely enthralled by the art of motion picture. Imagine never seeing this in your entire life, being like a factory worker, right? Never witnessed anything like this in your life. And then you go sit down in a room and you watch yourself walk out of the factory. This was like science fiction to a lot of these people who maybe had seen photography here and there, gotten their pictures taken, but had never seen motion pictures. And the silent film era was taking off at this time too. By the early 1900s, America's prime film hub was actually in New York City. Thousands of short silent films were made here and played in local theaters and projection halls. There were a few film studios with interior sets, but almost all of the exterior video was shot out across New York City and New Jersey. The downside of this was the weather. It would snow in the winter and be super cold. But that wasn't the only downside. The big glaring one is that Thomas Edison was in New Jersey. As I've already stated, which I just feel like I personally cannot state this enough, Thomas Edison was a greedy asshole. There's really no other way to phrase that. He owned more than 1,000 patents. Almost every single one that was in the motion picture technology industry at that time, he owned. He had the financial backing, and he had invented and patented the kinetoscope after all. The patents applied to both the creation of the films as well as the technology used to run movie theaters. So Thomas Edison was able to threaten other patent holders into forming a sort of motion picture consortium that he would go on to head. This organization became known as the Motion Picture Patent Company. Basically, to summarize, if you were a filmmaker in New York or New Jersey, where the hub was in the United States, and you made a film, Thomas Edison would in fact sue the crap out of you for all sorts of patent violations. The way you made it, the way you distributed it, the way you showed it. You would have no choice but to join his little association and then basically pay him any and all revenue that you received. And a lot of people took issue with that, especially because Edison was known for hiring New York mobsters to be the delivery men for his threats. Pay me what I'm due and join my organization or I will, screw you up pretty bad. No bueno. So people decided to get as far away from Edison as possible. California was far away, travel would be long and expensive, and judges there weren't as friendly to East Coast patents. Los Angeles, California it was. It had warm weather and mostly sunny days, and the sun actually tremendously improved the shots on antique film. The more natural lighting, the better, the more you could see. The good weather ensured more production days, cheap land for building huge studio lots and sets. In New York City and also New Jersey, it was incredibly expensive to do so a lot of studios didn't make huge sets. In California, possibilities were limitless, and it also had a desert landscape that was exotic looking to many people. So it became the primary location of the motion picture industry. The first film completed in Hollywood was 1908's The Count of Monte Cristo, although the production of that film actually had begun in Chicago. By 1911, Nestor Studios became the first movie studio to be built on Sunset Boulevard. By 1915, most of the major motion picture companies from New York City had actually already relocated to Hollywood, and then some new ones popped up. But they call them the Big Five, and those five, like the main players in all of film, were MGM, Paramount Pictures, RKO, 20th Century Fox, and Warner Brothers. My all-time favorite film from this era is Le Voyage dans la Lune, or Voyage to the Moon. It's an iconic 15-minute French science fiction film that came out in 1902. I have a huge wall decal of the moon from that film on my wall, and I'm looking at it right now. It's the infamous scene where the lunar capsule lands in the moon's eye. I am a complete film nut. I actually wanted to go to film school. That's all I pretty much, still want to do with my life, but I also like to eat and pay bills. But Le Voyage dans la Lune was the film that just really tugged at my heartstrings. Like, wow, this is my favorite medium. This is a medium I want to devote my life to. Both a black and white version, as well as a more recently colorized version, are available on YouTube. It's just 15 minutes of your life. Start with the black and white one, but the colorized one, I actually just recently stumbled across that and I cried. Like, I actually cried human tears. I cried tears. It's 120 years old. Process that. 120-year-old science fiction film. So from the early 1900s on, films were increasingly focusing more on storyline and acting rather than just documenting an everyday activity. Slapstick comedy became popular, and special effects were increasing, like painted backdrops, stop motion, double exposure effects, inverted shots, variable camera speeds, reverse motion, and even animation. In 1910, movies were made using multiple reels of film, so actors were finally starting to get acknowledged. They were being acknowledged in the credits of films by the 1910s. As technology increased, so did the running times of movies. Artificial lighting evolved, allowing limitless possibilities for day or nighttime, interior or exterior filming. And up until this point, most of the major world film production had been actually coming out of Europe, particularly France, England, and Germany. Well, World War I absolutely decimated Europe's film industry. All of Europe, really. Not even just one particular country. It decimated all of Europe. Hollywood in America was largely unfazed. In fact, they were becoming more popular than ever because they were able to consistently put out films during the war. After World War I, Hollywood had cemented its place as the world's film production hub. Actors like Greta Garbo, Joan Crawford, Max Linder, Lillian Gish, and Buster Keaton became worldwide stars. Celebrity culture was also a fledgling industry at that time. Everyday people had favorite actors and actresses. Gossip magazines were starting to surface. Studios would play political games and share dramas about opposing stars with gossip mags or Hollywood newspapers. There would be blackmail attempts. Actors and actresses were on full display for the world. And there were so many scandals. It would take the next 10 years to quite literally go over all of them, but we're going to just hit a couple of the highlights during the silent film era. I'm sure you've all heard the name Fatty Arbuckle. Now, people generally use it as a nickname for a portly animal. Well, that namesake is an actual actor named Roscoe Arbuckle from the silent era. He popularly became known as Fatty Arbuckle due to, obviously, his weight. His movies were so popular that by 1918, Paramount Pictures offered him a 3-year, $3 million contract. In today's money, the equivalent would be $54 million. Can you imagine? By all accounts, Roscoe Arbuckle was an upstanding citizen. He was also a stand-up comedian. Everyone loved him. People loved his movies. Other silent era actors loved working with him, by all accounts. And on September 5th of 1921, Roscoe Arbuckle checked into the St. Francis Hotel with 3 of his friends. They invited a handful of women to a room in which they were partying. At one point in the evening, Virginia Rapet, another silent film actress, began to scream from room 1219, Roscoe Arbuckle's room. A hotel doctor examined her and said it was just the effect of alcohol and let her go. 2 days later, Virginia was hospitalized. Her friend there with her told the doctor that Roscoe Arbuckle had raped her. A rape test determined that no sexual assault had taken place. Sadly, Virginia died the day after she was hospitalized due to a ruptured bladder. However, due to what Virginia's friend told the doctor and then they called police arrested Arbuckle, claiming that his weight while he was raping her caused her bladder to rupture. Arbuckle always maintained his innocence, but the San Francisco DA, Matthew Brady, wanted to advance his career, and prosecuting one of the world's biggest movie stars and winning would pretty much do the trick. Virginia's friend, who made that original rape claim, had a lengthy criminal history and at one time was caught on microphone trying to blackmail Arbuckle's attorney into giving her money to recant. Other witnesses would later say that they were coerced into providing false testimonies by the DA. There was absolutely zero evidence whatsoever. The gossip mags posted illustrations of Fatty Arbuckle looking like a large gorilla overpowering young girls with his weight. They called him a pervert and a lecher. And somehow it went from rape to rape with a Coca-Cola bottle or rape with a champagne bottle. Paramount Pictures obviously pulled his contract and made statements against him. He was blacklisted from Hollywood entirely. All of Hollywood turned against him. And all of his friends refused to make public statements for the most part, because they, in turn, would be reprimanded by their own studios. Because don't forget, guys, at this point, studios owned their actors and actresses. A studio would have a contract with a particular actor or actress. Roscoe Arbuckle was tried for murder 3 times by the DA. Each trial ended in a mistrial. The third trial's decision took a couple minutes to reach, and the jury actually wrote an apology letter to Roscoe because it was clear by the statements of the people of other witnesses and everything else that he likely did not commit this crime. His name had been cleared, but the association was forever there. It financially ruined him, drove him into bankruptcy. And I mean, that didn't even matter because he was completely written out of Hollywood to begin with. 10 years later, in 1933, Warner Brothers actually ended up calling him and offering him a feature film contract. He supposedly told his wife, "This is the best day of my life," but he would actually never go on to make a film. He died that very night, that night he received the phone call, of a heart attack at age 46. Then you have Charlie Chaplin, who was a total degenerate. He was married multiple times and had an insane number of children, most of which he refused to actually acknowledge. One of his baby mamas sued him for paternity even. Fearing that this would be a trend, he paid a doctor $25,000 to make false entries on birth certificates of a few of his children, basically saying, "I ain't the daddy." Also, he had a pedo problem. Wife number 1 was 16 when Chaplin was 30. He divorced her when they had a young son and he died prematurely. Well, he then got a 15-year-old girl pregnant when he was in his mid-30s. He married her so he would not be arrested for sex with an underage child. She eventually went on to bear him 2 children. She apparently aged out, and then he ended up marrying wife number 3 when he was in his 50s and she was just 17 years old. She would give birth to 8 children. Overall, Charlie Chaplin was married 3 times and had 10 children, at least children that he publicly claimed. He was well known to frequent orgies and sex parties, and it's said that the book Lolita was actually partially inspired by his sexual relationship with yet another underage girl. He actually ended up living in Switzerland for a while to escape the law, not only for underage sex, but also taxes. And then after he left and went to Switzerland to basically escape the law, his career just pretty much slowly set. Gloria Swanson was an incredibly popular silent film actress who ended up going into the golden age of Hollywood. It was very difficult for actors from the silent era to actually pivot over to the age of sound and the golden age. They weren't used to the technology. It required a whole different type of movement, a type of voice, and they were not used to that. There were only a small handful who did. Gloria Swanson, Joan Crawford. Gloria Swanson was also one of the first women who started her own production company, which was largely unheard of at that time. And she was one of the first people to sign a 7-figure contract. So you can imagine she was very popular and very respected. Well, in 1925, while working on a film in France, Swanson fell in love with a local French marquis. And she was married back in the States. She had a husband and a child, but she fell in love with a French marquis. And of course, naturally, since we're talking about mess, she got pregnant by this French marquis. Well, because of the Roscoe Arbuckle situation that happened, studios had come out with a thing called morality clauses. And morality clauses were clauses that actors had to sign as part of their contract that held them to high standards and basically noted different types of behavior and conduct that would be inexcusable and have them basically blacklisted, their contract destroyed, and thrown out of Hollywood. Cheating on your husband and having, that person's baby definitely would not fit in with the standards. So, knowing she would lose everything, Gloria Swanson chose to have a secret abortion. She went septic, almost died because of it, and she would go on to marry and divorce a total of 6 times before largely fading into obscurity. And then one of the era's biggest mysteries, the death of William Desmond Taylor, one of the biggest directors of the period. He directed like 60 films and acted in 27. Well, on February 1st of 1922, he was murdered by an unknown assailant in his home. He'd been shot, and there was no sign of any sort of forced entry. He hadn't been robbed because all of his valuables were still in the home, and there was still cash in multiple places, even on his body. And when police arrived at the home, they discovered that there had been a 12-hour delay in reporting the shooting. And then they found bigwigs from the film studio, burning some of Taylor's papers in his fireplace. There were a handful of witnesses who had put Mabel Normand, another incredibly troubled silent film star, at his home that evening. And she became the prime suspect. Of course, tabloids and gossip magazines ran with a story about orgies and sex fiends and dope fiends, and even Satanism, like the occult. Then it was publicly discovered that William Desmond Taylor wasn't even his real name. It was actually William Cunningham Dean Tanner. Okay, weird, but not as weird as the magical emergence of a wife and child, a whole ass family, whom he had apparently deserted 16 years prior. More than 300 people would go on to confess to murdering Taylor, but his murder has never been solved. And Mabel Normand, who had many psychological issues in her own right, she was a very talented actress, one of the biggest of her time, but because she was merely associated with this murder and the prime suspect, she never saw her career come back from the rampant rumors surrounding her involvement. By the late 1920s, studios were finally incorporating sound by using sound on film and sound on disc techniques. The silent era was coming to an end, but not before giving us such classics as Metropolis, The Passion of Joan of Arc, A Trip to the Moon, Ben-Hur, Birth of a Nation, Nosferatu, and Phantom of the Opera. In 1927, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences was founded, and the first Academy Awards, or Oscar ceremony as we now know it, were presented in February of 1929. That Oscars had just 270 guests and lasted all but 15 minutes. It was held in 1929 in the Blossom Room of the Hollywood Roosevelt Hall in Hollywood, California. So 1929 officially marks the end of the silent era and the beginning of what we know as the golden age of Hollywood. And I'm going to be completely honest with you. I'm absolutely obsessed with the golden age of Hollywood. Never was. Older I get, the more I am. Marlene Dietrich's biography is just beyond, just utterly fascinating. Betty Davis, the whole bit. I wanted to give some context for the next episode. Walter Elias Disney was born on December 5th of 1901. So starting on the next episode, I want to pick up with Walt Disney, his birth, his childhood, how he came into Disney, and so forth. Lots to talk about, but I at least wanted to place the context of what Walt Disney, as he was growing up, the type of environment that he saw, the silent film, morality clauses, World War I, the different types of film, and so forth. It's very important, the time period that Walt Disney came in and the studio was founded. But that is it for today, guys. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you are as interested in this stuff as I am. It's just one of my favorite pieces of pop culture. Again, you've been listening to We Saw the Devil. I'm your host, Robin. Don't forget to check us out at wesawthedevil.com. Follow us on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Shoot us an email or leave that 5-star review if you've enjoyed the episode. I'm going to be alternating these episodes. So the next episode is going to be a news update episode. We've got some stuff going on in the Lori Vallow case, got some more stuff with the Delphi case, and a lot of other stuff happening in the news too. And then after that, we will come back to the dark side of Disney. Thanks again for listening, guys. Until next crime.